Somehow, simple fishermen out to get some prime catch found themselves confronted not just with a bear, but two bear cubs. The stakes were high, and this cold Russian lake was not very forgiving. The fishermen clearly saw the cubs were struggling. However, they watched and thought maybe it was worth the chance to try to help. Could the fishermen potentially save these young cubs from an awful death in the freezing waters just as their young lives were beginning? Wait, but if they did succeed, what would they do next? It's not even just those thoughts that plagued them. There is another character that caused much fear and anxiety. Yes, we're talking about the bear cubs' own mother bear, who may have been to blame for the entire predicament. Sorry, but we have to warn that these stories will most likely tug you at your heartstrings. It is an emotional story, but filled with love and not just the predictable loving relationships you picture in nature. Of course, there's nothing like the bond between babies and their mothers. But again, this story could have you questioning that bond. After this mother bear did the unthinkable to save herself, while sacrificing her own flesh and blood, someone else steps up to the challenge and becomes a hero. When this new hero comes about, a brand new loving bond was formed. First, we need to explain the setting of this complicated tale. In Russia's northwestern sector, there is a freshwater lake named Lake Wygozero. At times, the lake's temperature can plunge to -4 degrees Fahrenheit or -20 degrees Celsius. Obviously, these freezing temperatures are much too cold for humans to take a dip. So remember that as we get into this story, also you should know that the lake is pretty big and can be a danger not just for fishermen, but any wildlife creatures. From outdoorsy people to animals who were raised outdoors, living in the wild is never easy for anyone. Surely, the bears in the story also know that from their attempt to cross Lake Wygozero. Let us get into this troubling tale. Well, it began when a mother bear decided to take her two young cubs to the edge of Lake Wygozero, hoping to make it across. Sadly, her hopeful optimism did not seem to be enough to help her baby bears in this situation. Well, you know what comes next. The mother bear just jumps right into the lake with her babies, thinking they could manage somehow. Once they began to swim, it became very obvious that the tiny cubs were not able to keep up with the mama bear. Clearly, she could see they were not strong enough for the journey, and all the while, the two cubs held on for their lives. A lot of wildlife enthusiasts have actually witnessed mother bears make enormous sacrifices for their babies, whether that was carrying them along dangerous terrain or fending off predators. However, this particular mother bear was not like others. Apparently, this bear had her own plans once she realized her young weren't keeping up. Surprisingly, she released them and began to swim alone. Yes, it's hard to understand how any mother, bear or not, could ever do this, but it's the wild. Alright, we do have to give you some more details before you judge the mother bear too harshly. During the time in question, there were some pretty harsh conditions. The mother bear had tried to hold on tightly to her cubs, but the lake's current was very strong. So once the current pulled the cubs and mother apart, she made a split decision. However, that decision may or may not have been the best thing. The mother bear just moved on, hoping her cubs would somehow make it. She continued to swim and found land. Now, let's get back to their struggling cubs. Desperately, they had clung to their mother, but then she effectively abandoned them. Remember, this is a freezing cold lake, and on top of that, the cubs have no clue how to swim. As time passed, their energy drained. Truly, the cubs need some sort of miracle. Can you imagine what those cubs were enduring this whole time? How would they feel as their lives were hanging by just a thread? Of course, we don't fully understand the way a bear's mind works, but sure, we have the feelings too. Naturally, they would have been terrified. The two kept treading waters since their lives fully depended on it, even though it was their first time in water. Before they knew it, the tides changed and there was more than a glimmer of hope. Just as they could have sank to their deaths, a boat came into vision. The two cubs didn't even need to cry out because the boat saw them immediately. Also, the two bear cubs began to swim towards the boat when they spotted it, hoping for a possible rescue in this dire situation. Aboard the boat were a group of fishermen who had set out to catch some tasty fish. However, they never expected to come across the scene. Now as they approached the cubs, they saw that things were really disastrous. From their lack of energy, the cub could barely tread enough to keep their heads above the water. Upon encountering these struggling cubs, the fishermen realized they must act. However, these fishermen smartly observed one major obstacle. Apparently, the mother bear was lingering nearby. Even though she had abandoned the cubs, the fishermen believed she could still act on a motherly instinct in order to protect the cubs. Thus, they were fearful about taking action to save the bear cubs. Therefore, they decided to wait a bit until the mother bear was far enough from the boat before taking action. As the fishermen patiently waited for the mother bear to be at a safe distance from their boat, they devised a plan to rescue the poor cub. Also, many worries started to arise in their heads. Yes, maybe they would be able to save them, but then what would they do with the two bear cubs on the boat? Of course, there were plenty of questions they would need to confront once it was time. As all this went on, one fisherman decided it would be great to capture the rescue mission on tape. As the bear cubs approached, he grabbed his smartphone to record everything. Soon enough, one of the cubs reached the side of the boat and began to try to climb it up. The man reached out and grabbed a paw to help. Even though the tiny cub tired securing himself, it was much too high for his reach. Also, he was very weak from treading around the lake. Thus, one fisherman devised a special plan. He collected their fishing gear, searching for the right tool that the cub would grab onto. Sadly, the tools were still too far for the bear. Actually, the fisherman didn't end up thinking of the next brilliant plan to save the cubs. In fact, the very cubs themselves acted next. Surely one of the most intimidating parts of a bear is their sharp teeth. You can guess what happened next. One of the cubs jumped onto the boat's side, attempting to gain some traction. For the time, it worked. Although this cub managed to get hold of the boat, the two were still much too far from the boat's landing. They desperately needed some assistance from the fishermen. Later on, these fishermen explained they could not look the other way. In their hearts, they could not possibly let these young cubs drown in their death. They wanted to do everything they could in order to save them. However, they had to consider the dangers they were in too. Yes, they were a bit far to be able to grab onto the cubs. However, if they could just get a bit closer, maybe something could work. Yet, even if they got closer, there was a chance of slipping and becoming the bear's last meal. In order for the rescue to be a success, the two groups needed to fully trust each other. Then something incredible happened. One fisherman looked into the eye of the cub who had locked his jaw onto the boat. It felt like their eyes peered into each other's souls. During this intense wordless exchange, they both understood that they could trust one another. It seemed like the young cub was just pleading with the man for his life. Those fishermen already agreed upon themselves they would try their very level best to rescue the bear cubs. However, saying and doing are very different things. Once they metaphorically pulled the trigger, these fishermen would need to live with the consequences, good or bad, forever. Now the big moment came when they quickly came up with a new way to pull the cubs onto the ship with their net. As the clock was ticking, they decided to go with their fisherman's net. However, they knew that this net made for fish was not necessarily guaranteed to hold the weight of a bear cub, let alone two fully grown bear cubs. Yet, it was still worth a shot. Thus, they threw it into the water, hoping to reel in the cubs. Time was running out, and they hoisted the first cub onto the boat. Things got difficult. Clearly, this cub was much heavier than any fish they usually reeled in. Oh, and not to mention the fact that these bear cubs never experienced a net before. However, they might panic and freak out once they were released on the boat. Maybe they would think the men wanted to capture them. Even though these two cubs were totally helpless in the situation, the men remembered that bears are one of the most dangerous animals. Who knew what would happen in this situation, even to the so-called heroes? Thus, the men attempted to soothe and calm them as they reeled the cubs in. Hopefully, by placating them, the cubs would realize they meant no harm. The fishermen tugged and pulled, considered that an adult bear can weigh around 1,300 pounds. So even though these cubs were babies, they still were quite a lot for the men to handle. Not to mention, the bear cubs were soaked, and that alone added a bunch of weight on their hefty mass. Soon the fishermen feared they wouldn't be able to pull both the cubs onto the boat, but they kept trying regardless. Just as the whole mission seemed impossible, the fishermen reached into their hearts and pulled with renewed strength. Yes, slowly, they did make some progress, and the first cub got closer to the platform of the boat. Both parties were excited by the promise of this. Almost there, just one last big tug, and they would be halfway done in their rescue. At last, they successfully got the cub onto the boat, although there was no time for celebrating, seeing as they had another cub to rescue. With renewed confidence, they began again. This cub was a bit further off, but also he was in the water much longer and therefore probably had less energy than his brother. Although his situation was not so hopeful, the fishermen were sure they could help after finishing one successful rescue. Thus, they got closer and cast the net out trying to get him. Things went even more smoothly this time around. Using the net, they began pulling him in. The second bear was quite heavy too, but they needed to maintain their spirit and work hard to get him onto the boat. After going through this with one cub, they knew they just needed some determination and preservation to help these cubs. Alas, they got the second cub on board. Now, with both of the baby bears on their boat, what would happen next? Hearing that two bears were freely wandering on a boat with fishermen could sound troubling out of the context. However, it wasn't that straightforward, as you know. In this story, that news was cause for celebration. Think about how those two cubs almost met their end. It was a miracle that the fishermen rescued them. Once they were on the boat, the men got a good look at the bear cubs. As they looked at them, it was obvious they were shivering and shaking uncontrollably. Also, they looked frightened. Of course, it made sense because now that they were safe from drowning, they had to face humans, which they may or may not have ever been in contact with before. We're betting this was the first encounter. Seeing how scared and cold these cubs were, the fishermen truly felt for them. Now, they just wanted to do everything in their power to save them. However, they knew keeping them wasn't an option. Obviously, they needed to let the cubs go back to life in the wild, but on dry land. Since their mom was close by, they wanted to reunite the family. On the other word, they would all do what they could. They began to look for a place to take the cub onto the land. They wanted a part of the island where the mother bear was, since even though it seemed she abandoned their babies, she would probably want them back. At last, they seemed to have located the place they last spotted the mother bear. Would she still be nearby? And how would she react to this? Each person on the boat sat on the edge of their seat with anticipation for the big moment. However, they couldn't find the mother bear. Yet, the fishermen feared if she did appear, she may even attack the men. Even so, they decided to bravely return the cubs. They waited a bit to no avail, no mother bear in sight. After growing quite fond of the cubs, it was hard for the fishermen to say goodbye. However, they knew it is what they must do. Since the cubs still didn't have much energy, the men carried them to a safe place on the land, hoping their mother could find them easily. Saying bye, the men realized the cubs were safe and they too could live to share the tale. Lucky for them, they even captured the whole scene on camera, so people didn't need to just take them for their word. Everyone could see the incident on tape. Others are not always so fortunate, but we will get to that in a bit when we tell a story of a hiker and his encounter with wildlife. These fishermen were overjoyed at the success and warmed by the bond with the cubs they would remember for life. Bears, usually extremely aggressive, even being around cubs can be risky. It is incredible that the fisherman walked away unscathed. What he did was amazing, and without him, the two cubs wouldn't have lived on. Sometimes wild animals face danger, but so do hikers. They always take a risk while going hiking. They can suffer from dehydration and injury or run into a dangerous predator. Robert Biggs is one such hiker who is fearless. He recently reported to the Paradise Post his entire survival story. If you've seen The Revenant, you know what we're talking about. In the film, Leonardo DiCaprio's character explores a previously untouched area of nature in the early 1800s. The hiker Robert Biggs had a similar experience where he almost died in the woods in Northern California. While Robert Biggs was hiking in North Central California back in the spring of 2012, he never expected to find himself facing death. As he hiked the trail, he came across a mother bear with her cub. He even stopped to watch the family for a bit. Then, he decided to continue on his hike. this tiny encounter would end up meaning so much more than Robert Biggs could ever imagine. He thought he was just taking a moment to appreciate nature and a mother bear with her cute cub. However, this tiny moment would make the difference between life and death for him. However, while he was observing the black bear family, he was being watched. This man from Paradise, California, had no clue that something was watching him as he looked on at the newborn cub and mother bear about 40 feet from him. He was being stalked. Apparently, a fierce mountain lion was close by. He guessed it must have been stalking the little bear, but it was on me in seconds. Somehow this hiker got himself caught up in the food chain by walking along its path at this particular moment. Now his life was in danger. While he was turning to leave the bears, he told the Paradise Post that the mountain lion attacked him. Yes, it pounced right onto Big's backpack with his sharp claws. It began digging and he was forced to wrestle with a wild mountain lion. While speaking to the Huffing Post, he explained, "He grabbed me from behind and knocked me to the ground. I was on my knees. I had my rock pick out because I was on a steep incline, and I smashed the cat in the head with it. He screamed, but he didn't let go." Just a rock pick and a backpack stood between Biggs and the mountain lion, and subsequently an untimely demise. Thus, he tried to strike again with his weapon, but he said, "That's when a blur on my left side grabbed the lion by its throat. Turns out it was a mama bear. I heard a tremendous screeching, some growling noises. Next, the bear ripped the mountain lion off Biggs' backpack before getting into a brawl with the cat. Alas, the bear came out as the champion, and Biggs said this was since the bear outweighed the cat 400 pounds to 100 pounds. The mountain lion fled the scene, and the bear returned to all the fours. Apparently, the bear looked right at Biggs before regrouping with her cub. After this wild attack and rescue, Biggs was able to escape only with some scratches. He had been hiking this exact 2-mile trek in California's Bean Soup Flat area for many years, never imagining this type of life-threatening attack. After getting home, he ignored his wife's request to visit a hospital. He chose to put a peroxide on and wash up. His wife said there were puncture wounds and skin was hanging off, and you don't know what's in their paws. While speaking with the Huffing Post, he expressed his gratitude to the bear. He said, "I'm 100% sure it did want to save my life. We made eye contact. I'd seen the bears before, and I know she knew who I was." Despite Robert Biggs' captivating testimony, California Department of Fish and Game (DFG) came out shortly after to say that they doubted the legitimacy of his story. At first, they said evidence was inconclusive, according to the spokesman Andrew Huggin. Then shortly after, the DNA test results of the blood found on Biggs' backpack came back and showed no signs of an animal attack. The other tests came back with the same results. Biggs insisted he's not making anything up and had washed up after the attack. But Kristen McIntyre of the DFG said all of the evidence, the lab results, and investigation at the scene and the scratches on Mr. Biggs' arms is inconsistent with the mountain lion attack.